We've been looking at several of the systems in your body. The first one we started with was cardiovascular, and if you recall, that was just to get stuff where it's going. That's about all it does, just transporting things through the blood. But the ultimate purpose was to get to all the cells in your body. We just recently talked about the respiratory system, and obviously that ties into the circulatory because we saw how the alveoli were wrapped with capillaries that could pick up oxygen and also give off CO2 at that point so that you could have gas exchange in your body. And in a few days, we'll talk about the digestive system, which obviously that's the way humans take in nutrients to their body. We have to have proteins, carbs, fats, as we discussed earlier. We also have to have nucleic acids, so those biomolecules come in, but they have to be, you have to do something with them is the point. And that's why all of these systems tend to go together, because obviously you have to pick things up from the digestive system with the cardiovascular system, and you have to combine it with the oxygen that you're breathing in. But it all comes down to this, doesn't it? We've got cells, and there's your 33 trillion cells that all have to have pretty much everything that you think of as a human is needing. So they need all of the nutrients that you take in. They need all of the oxygen that you use, but they also produce waste materials because we know that CO2 is not needed in the body. It's a waste that's generated, we'll find next week, from another type of respiration called aerobic respiration, but all kinds of other little things are happening in the cell that have to do with chemistry and the different parts of the system that we'll talk about. So let's look at it this way. What exactly goes into your human body? For one thing, first couple of weeks of school, we talked about carbohydrates, and those are just basically compounds made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And that would include fats also. We also have proteins, and if you think about an amino acid, which is the monomer of building the polymer protein, it consists of those same carbon, hydrogen, oxygens with the addition of a nitrogen molecule. We also take in other things. I mean, we have to have salt on our food most of the time just for seasoning. We have minerals, vitamins, especially water. We take in a lot of water every day, but all of these things are coming into your system. So why don't you just keep getting bigger and bigger like a blimp? Obviously, we take it in to use it at a certain point, and then whatever is left over that's not used in some way to make energy or to pull energy out of a substance for the cell, we have waste materials that are left over that have to be dealt with in some way. So what exactly has to come out of a cell, or what does a cell not need in the material that it's taking in? Or another way of asking it, in a certain situation, what must come out? Because not everything is necessarily a waste at every particular time, as we'll see. So the big one here, CO2, carbon dioxide. We mentioned that with the respiratory system. So cells take in oxygen and they give off CO2, which means humans do that. We breathe in oxygen and we breathe out CO2 as a waste product. We also have all of those nitrogen wastes that are left over when we digest protein. Remember, proteins have that extra nitrogen added to it, and that's where we get all kinds of nitrogen compounds in our body, and the body just doesn't need those, especially these two. These are made in large amounts, ammonia and uric acid. Ammonia, you know that's true because if you ever smelt a diaper from one of your younger siblings, it smells just like ammonia. So there's a lot of ammonia in human waste just because of that. We also have to give off excesses of certain things. So obviously some things we take in and we just don't need it, but sometimes we take things in and then we do something with it and now we don't need it anymore. So for the example, salt, minerals, and water especially, water we need, and sometimes we take it in, but once we take it in and use it for something, it's considered a waste product. Or we may take in too much of it, which makes it a waste. Also, we'll look at some other wastes that are metabolized at some point. So cells are really good at creating a lot of little molecules that are just not needed for anything, and it would be detrimental to a cell if it had to keep that inside somewhere. And this process, we'll just call it in general excretion. We don't have a particular excretory system, although sometimes we try to put the kidneys and the colon together and call it that. But we have excretion happening all over the place on your body. And anywhere we need to get rid of something, a molecule that has no further purpose, then that would be considered excretion. So we mentioned one of those yesterday with the lungs. The lungs excrete CO2 along with some other gases. So we talked about the fact that sometimes onion, garlic, and some foods just have molecules in them that have to be disposed of because we don't really need those in our system. And you can often smell that on someone's breath. Alcohol is an example. The reason we can do a breathalyzer on someone who's caught drunk driving is because alcohol doesn't just coat your mouth and you're not just smelling the alcohol on someone's breath. You're literally smelling it in the air that they're breathing out because it becomes, alcohol is a molecule that diffuses out of the blood in the lungs as a waste product. We haven't mentioned this yet, but your skin also has some excretory functions. We know skin definitely sweats. I mean, that's obvious to us. And one of the purposes of that is not just excretion, but the water in the sweat evaporating. When you change a liquid to a gas, it requires energy. And so that takes the energy from your body in the form of heat. And that's the way humans do it. We excrete water through our skin. You're probably doing it right now, even though you're not necessarily on a hot summer day just sweating droplets all over the place. Sometimes we do excrete more than others through the skin in some form. We have two glands that actually sweat on your skin, though, two excretory glands. And as we said, most of this is just water, but there also are salts and other metabolites that would be toxic to your body if they built up in some form. Now, these don't come anywhere near what the kidney is doing, but still, they're there. The other one is an apocrine gland. So two different types of sweat glands, and these are interesting. They both occur in your skin, as it shows here. Apocrine specifically has to excrete into a hair follicle. And so when you see that sweat coming out, it would be exuding through somewhere where a hair is sticking out of your skin. The ecrines just excrete onto the skin. So that's the difference in those two. They both carry pretty much the same constituents. There's a little bit more oil in the apocrine because that's part of this, part of your skin you probably noticed is oily, and that has other purposes that we'll talk about later. Also interesting, different parts of your body have different concentrations of either ecrine or apocrine glands. Usually when you have hair, you're going to have the apocrine, obviously, because it needs a hair follicle. But also you've got a big concentration on the palm of your hands of the ecrine glands that are sweating. You probably notice you get sweaty palms when you're nervous or something like that. Also, apocrine sweat tends to grow more bacteria. So body odor on people, generally, it's not your body that smells. It's the fact that you have bacteria growing within the sweat products that come out. And there's a little bit more nutrition in the apocrine gland. So you typically have a lot of bacteria growing there. And an obvious way not to have that is to wash those off frequently. We also have antiperspirants, which literally stop your apocrine glands from sweating, which is probably not a good long-term solution. You don't want a drug that literally cuts down on your sweat glands.
Between you and the rest of the world lies an interface that makes up 16% of your physical weight. This is your skin, the largest organ in your body. Laid out flat, it would cover close to 1.7 square meters of ground. Its purpose may seem obvious, to keep our insides in. But a look beyond the surface reveals that it plays a surprising number of roles in our lives. First, the basics. Skin is the foundation of the integumentary system, which also incorporates your hair, nails, and specialized glands and nerves. Made up of 3 layers, the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis, skin's thickness varies from 0.5 millimeters at its thinnest and up to 4 millimeters at its thickest. It also carries out 3 key functions: protecting, regulating, and sensing the world beyond its limits. On a daily basis, its huge surface processes hundreds, if not thousands, of physical sensations, relying mostly on large, pressure-sensitive skin components called Merkel cells. In your fingertips alone, there are 750 Merkel cells per each square centimeter of skin, coupled with over 2,500 receptors that give you your sense of touch. This surface is also the body's first major line of defense. Without it, you'd be a soggy mass of tissue and fluids, fatally exposed to the elements. Skin effectively seals off your insides and also absorbs pressure and shock with flexible collagen that makes up most of its dermal layer. The epidermis is made up mainly of skin cells called keratinocytes that are completely replaced every 4 weeks. As new cells form at the base of the epidermis, older ones are pushed up. When these cells move upwards, they're filled with a hardened protein called keratin. Once they reach the surface, they form a tightly overlapping, waterproof layer that's difficult for invading microbes to breach. Any harmful microbes that make it into the epidermis will encounter Langerhans cells. This group of protective skin cells detects invaders and communicates their presence to resident immune system T cells, which react by launching an immune response. A crucial feature of this immune defense is the several thousand species of microorganisms that inhabit the planes, folds, and crevices of your skin. These microbes, which include bacteria and fungi, thrive in the sebum, an oily substance that's secreted onto the skin's surface by sebaceous glands nestled inside the dermis. These skin microbes keep the immune system in a state of constant surveillance, ensuring that it's ready to react if the body really is at risk. Beyond this protective role, your skin is also a sensory organ that helps regulate your body's temperature, 2 roles that are closely interlinked. Nerves detect whether your skin is warm or cold and communicate that information to your brain. In return, the brain instructs localized blood vessels to either expand if the body is too warm, releasing heat from the blood through the skin, or to constrict if the body is cold, which retains heat. At any given time, up to 25% of the body's blood is circulating through the dermis, making this process extremely efficient. Under warm conditions, the skin's sweat glands will secrete sweat via ducts onto the surface, transferring heat out of the body. Hair can also be stimulated to conserve or release body warmth. The average human has 5 million hair follicles embedded everywhere on the body, except the palms of your hands and soles of your feet. 90 to 150,000 of those are on your scalp, where they help shield the large surface area of your head from physical damage and sunburn. When you're cold, tiny muscles called arrector pili cause hair to stand upright across the body. That's the phenomenon known as goosebumps, and it traps body heat close to your skin. Skin's vast surface isn't just a shield, it also enables us to interact and connect with the world. Its multifunctional layer cools us down and keeps us warm. The integumentary system may be many things, but it's certainly more than skin deep.
We'll talk about the colon more coming up with the digestive system, but it has a significant role in excretion in your body too. We'll just put that on the back burner for now. And let's focus more on the final one here, the kidneys. This is by far the big excretory organ in your body that does so much for you that's why you can't live without your kidneys, or if you have them malfunctioning, you're very diseased in some form. You suffer from it greatly. So basically, kidneys, they regulate water, and by regulate I mean they can excrete it. So they excrete water when it's in excess. They can also excrete salt if you have too much in your body, and that includes all salts, not just sodium chloride, but any salt that you would find in your food that chemically is salty, along with minerals. And it also keeps the pH of your blood at a specific level. You can't change your blood pH hardly any at all without having some really serious ramifications from that. So that's a crucially important job, just regulating the acidity and the alkalinity of your bloodstream. And also a lot of other blood constituents that are there are regulated by kidneys in some form or the other. Your kidneys are located right underneath your rib cage. Part of it sticks up into your rib cage slightly, and they're toward the back of your torso. So this picture here doesn't show it exactly, you can't show it exactly three-dimensionally where it is, but the kidneys are connected, we'll see, to the urinary bladder, where excess water and all the other constituents are eliminated from your body. And we call that the urinary system. And kidneys are very complicated. You'll see on a video in a moment that all of these things here, it looks simpler here, even in this complicated drawing, than it actually is. Because notice here that it does have a vein coming out to go to the heart, and it's got an artery going in from the heart at some point. But it also has another tube coming out that takes away the waste products that are going to be generated by this particular kidney. Each kidney has about 1 million of these little subunits called nephrons. A unit of something is the actual working thing that's doing the job here. So when we say the kidneys do something, we actually mean that you've got 200 or 2 million nephrons that are acting to do what's happening. That's where the actual absorption and secretion is happening. Oh, and it does take at least one kidney, obviously, to keep you going. We do have 2 kidneys, and a person with 2 kidneys has just the extra redundancy of having plenty of kidney power to take care of filtration and cleaning the system. There are people who live with just 1 kidney, and that's why some people can donate a kidney to someone who has no functioning kidneys. So that's very common today, that kidney transplants are fairly, I say fairly easy, but they are fairly common in some places. I find this interesting too. 50 gallons per day of stuff comes out through your kidneys. Now, hang on, you don't go to the bathroom that often, because 49.5 of those gallons go back in through the kidneys. So we'll see in a minute in the video that this is a useful process, because instead of just going and picking out the things that aren't needed in your bloodstream, the kidneys actually just take everything out pretty much. And then they pretty much almost put everything back in, except for about a half a gallon there per day. So that 0.5 gallons is going to be the excretory part of this system. Now this brings up a kind of a chemical physiological thing in humans, and actually in other animals too. But the fact that you're in certain concentrations of an environment, for example, these fish here obviously are in water. And unlike humans, we're not necessarily in water, but we have a blood system that pretty much means our cells are in water. And that's the way we can make these two things have something in common. But think about this. Fish that are in pure water, most animal bodies are slightly salty, about probably 3% salt at any one time. And that is absolutely crucial for cells to function, is to have the absolute exact, what we call saltiness, or the word for that is osmolarity. It's the concentration of salt or whatever is in the solute compared to the liquid part of your cells. And when you think of it, think of it this way. What happens, I don't know if you've ever tried to can pickles, but You have to get the saltiness around the pickles when you're making them, exactly the saltiness of the cucumber that you put in. And if you don't, the pickles either shrivel up or bloat up really big and don't taste good. Um, Another example is if you have ever noticed you put your hand in water for a long time, and if it's just tap water, you pull your hands out after a few minutes and they're wrinkled. Now, that gives the impression that your skin is shrinking because you think of it as wrinkling. That's actually not true. Your skin is growing when you put it in tap water. And we'll see in a minute that's because your skin is saltier than the water that you put your hand in. And that means if you had diffusion happening, diffusion always goes from the greatest concentration to the lowest concentration. And if we're thinking of water, if your skin is slightly salty, that means it can't be 100% watery. Does that make sense? So let's say my skin is 3% salty, the cells in my skin. Then if I put it in water, that's 100% water. Well, how much water is in my skin? 97%, because 3% of it is salty, 97% is water, and that means the water in the sink will start seeping or diffusing into my skin cells. And that's one of the rules of nature. Osmolarity means that, or diffusion in this case, means that things go from where they're most concentrated to where they're least concentrated. There are some things in the world that are called osmoconformers, like jellyfish. A lot of little ocean creatures, they don't really care what saltiness they're in because their body can adjust to it. Everything else in the world, including humans, are called osmoregulators. That means they have to work, or their body has to be programmed and the mechanics have to be there to make their body regulate their osmolarity. So, for example, let's think about the fish again. We have two different salty environments on planet Earth. A freshwater fish, as you see on the left here, think about it. It lives in Beaver Lake somewhere, and Beaver Lake is considered fresh water. It's not salty like the ocean. The ocean has a lot of salt in it. Beaver Lake has a little bit, but hardly any, which means if you put a fish in Beaver Lake, the fish's body, which is, about 3% saltiness, is going to now be in water that's 100% watery. So the same thing's going to happen to that fish as in your hand. Water is going to start soaking into that fish, and if it didn't have kidneys or something to regulate that, it would just start bloating up like a balloon. In fact, that does happen. Have you ever noticed when one of your goldfish dies, it always floats to the top, but in a few hours it bloats up really big because it no longer is functioning. Its kidneys are not functioning because it's essentially dead. And so that means water is still going into the cells and puffing it up and just making it bloat up. The exact opposite would be true, though, with a marine fish, one that lives in the ocean, because that fish's body is less salty than the water that it's floating in. So, for example, if the fish were 3% salt, that means it's 97% water, but the water could be 90%, 90% water and 10% salt, which means the water is saltier than the fish. In that case, water would be constantly seeping out of the fish, and the fish would just dry up into a little shriveled up dead fish. So we don't want that happening to our cells either. And when you think about it, your blood is mostly water, and it has a osmolarity of about 3%. So, as we said, your body and your cells and everything is pretty close to about 3% saltiness, which means you're about 97% water. And you can't vary hardly any from that. When you do, you start feeling it, because if you start lowering your osmolarity, or raising it rather, you start feeling thirsty. That's the symptom that something is wrong, and you're dehydrating at some point. So we have a very good system of thirst, which is a very strong feeling that you get. And I think that's why God gave it to you, because, it's very important that you just don't say, oh, I feel thirsty, but it's not a big deal. No, if you're thirsty, you need water very quickly to regulate the water level and the osmolarity of your bloodstream and your cells. Yeah, here's a picture just showing how diffusion works. So it typically, if something has a choice, it goes through a membrane so that it equals out eventually. We call that equilibrium, and that's what your body is trying to do constantly. It's trying to make your everything in your body even, or we've used that word homeostasis before. Yeah, here's an example of different types of things and different saltiness. So those do have names like isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. But if we put a cell in water that's very salty, it shrivels up. If we put a cell in water that's less salty than it is, it bloats up until something happens. It usually explodes, or we call it lysis. And that's why your blood needs to be exactly the right molarity so that your bloodstream there in the middle keeps all of your cells at just the right level of the water that's in it in some form. So pretty important, isn't it? The blood has a lot to do with what your cells are doing, and it has to because, as we said, your blood and plasma, remember plasma can get out of your bloodstream and basically surround your cells. And so that's very important because if that changes in some way, that means every one of your 33 trillion cells is going to change in some way. And that's probably not a change that we want to happen. All right, so let's call that osmoregulation. And all that is just balancing out the water in your system with the salts to make sure that your plasma, your bloodstream, because that is your water that you're swimming in, your bloodstream, that is what's important to you. So we need to balance that out. We tend to think about not getting enough water, but it would be possible to get too much water too. But that's what we're going to look at. How does your body know to keep something regulated just perfectly? And so back to the kidneys again. That's the purpose, or one of the purpose of the kidneys is not just to excrete water in excess, but to really measure it very specifically so that it's excreting just the right amount of water. If you're crawling around thirsty on a desert, you're probably not going to go to the restroom very much because your body senses that you're dehydrating, you need water, and it's definitely not going to excrete water at that point. However, if you just have downed 3 Pepsis in a row just because you were eating pizza quickly, you've probably got a lot more water in your system now than you actually need, and your kidneys kick in instantly and start trying to excrete that water, the excess water, before your cells that in a hypertonic solution, they'll start swelling up and exploding. And you probably don't want that happening on a typical day. Anyway, your kidneys also regulate those salts and the minerals, and as we said, the pH and a lot of other constituents that will be.
Detoxify itself are a liver and a kidney, although 2 kidneys are preferable. But the kidneys themselves are mysterious little bean-shaped black boxes. Dirty blood goes in, clean blood and urine come out. But how? In today's video, we'll go over the anatomy of the kidneys and the physiology involved in cleaning your blood. Hello and welcome. If you're new here, my name is Patrick, and this channel is all about anatomy and how the body works. The kidneys have a few jobs in our bodies, like helping us regulate fluid levels, keeping different ions in check, and clearing the waste from our blood and excreting it through pee. Each kidney is about the size of your closed fist. You can find them straddling the sides of your spinal column, just above the small of your back. We usually visualize these little beans from the back because they're actually behind the abdominal cavity where you'd find the other big organs. Each kidney has an adrenal gland on top that pumps out the hormone adrenaline. And it's actually kind of intuitive naming, since the Latin root for kidney is renal. So the adrenal gland makes adrenaline and sits on top of the kidneys. Coming down from the kidneys are the 2 ureters, tubes that transport urine made by the kidneys into the bladder. From there, a tube called the urethra transports urine outside the body. But we get to see some fun stuff once we crack open the kidney itself. If you're learning this in class, you'll see this classic cross-section a lot. In general, we can break it into 3 regions: the cortex, medulla, and renal pelvis. I'm about to blow your mind with how easy these are to remember. The cortex is the outermost layer of kidney tissue, just like the cortex in the brain is the outermost layer. And I like to imagine the kidney like a big O, while the cortex is a C that wraps around it. The medulla is the middle layer, which I remember because of the word overlap between medulla, medium, medius, and middle. Finally, the renal pelvis is the flattened uppermost end of the ureter, and while it might not look like a pelvis, it does go directly to the pelvis. Plus, it's usually illustrated as yellow on most color diagrams, implying that it's carrying pee. Now, this mess of blood vessels and tubules here is the renal pedicle, or hilum. It's where the renal artery brings blood in, the renal vein brings blood out, and the renal pelvis ships waste to the bladder. Those are the main three regions, but we need to get more granular to understand how the kidneys filter blood. The cortex is a thin layer, but it's where a whole lot of action happens. It's filled with nephrons, the functional units of the kidney. Now that phrase, functional unit, just means each of these nephrons are the thing that actually do the filtering of the blood. Multiply that times the 1 million nephrons you have in each kidney, and voila, you've got a functioning organ. And since filtration happens mostly in the cortex, we need a way for blood to get in and out and for waste products to head to the bladder. That's where the medulla comes in. Blood vessels run through these areas in the medulla, otherwise known as renal columns. This lets them transport blood to and from those filtration units in the cortex. From there, these triangle-shaped tissues, which are appropriately called renal pyramids, funnel those waste products to the renal pelvis. Each pyramid has a bunch of collecting ducts that merge into bigger ducts that merge into even bigger ducts before merging with a renal pelvis. We usually have around 8 of these renal pyramids, these cortex combos or lobes, per kidney. And I like to imagine each lobe like a pizza slice where the urine is colored cheese and the blood is the red crust. Look, I know it's gross, but you're gonna remember it. So all that anatomy taken together, we can start piecing together how the kidney filters blood. A lot of blood comes in through the renal arteries, like 20% of cardiac output. Those arteries then branch off into smaller and smaller blood vessels called arterioles. And when those branches get to a nephron, they bundle up into little clumps of special capillaries called glomerulus. I remember this one because it looks like a bunch of blood vessels kind of glom together, and they're really, really tiny. Most people have 3 glomeruli per square millimeter of kidney tissue, or about 2,000 per square inch, although everyone's different. And these capillaries actually have tiny holes in them, which are about 50 to 100 nanometers wide. You may hear them referred to as fenestrated capillaries, from the Latin root for windows. And these windows are big enough to let some small particles like glucose, amino acids, and water through, but keep big blood cells, immune cells, and other big proteins from leaving. It also has a few other barriers in place to keep certain substances from passing through into the tubules, but that's more complex. That bundle of blood vessels is surrounded by a few layers of epithelial cells called Bowman's capsule, kind of like a wraparound funnel that makes some waste products end up in the right tube. Together, this unit is called the renal corpuscle, which means little body. From here, we come across a jumble of blood vessels and tubules that I know looks overwhelming, but you can do this. I believe in you, you've got this. Branching off Bowman's capsule is a long tubule that starts in the renal cortex, dips into the medulla, then comes back to the cortex where it empties waste products into a collection duct. The closest part to the corpuscle is the proximal convoluted tubule, while the farthest is the distal convoluted tubule, named with those direction terms that you're familiar with. The middle section is called the loop of Henle, and it gets a different name because it actually crosses from the cortex down into the medulla. Then after filtering through the tubules, the liquid, or what's called filtrate, empties back into a big collecting duct where it heads it towards the renal pelvis. But you notice that there are a bunch of blood vessels twisting around these tubules too. Do you remember how that arteriole came into Bowman's capsule and jumbled around? Well, that same arteriole exits the capsule and starts winding around those tubules and eventually becomes the renal vein. They're called peritubular capillaries when they're scattered around the convoluted tubules, hence peritubular. Then they're called the vasa recta, literally straight vessel, when they dance around the loop of Henle in the medulla. But why does it take such a weird and twisty route? Well, there's a point to this mess. The glomerulus is really porous, and it dumps a lot of stuff into the capsule, including things you actually want in your blood, like water and glucose. So after receiving this generous gift from the blood, the tubules actually move some of those materials back into the blood vessel. Then, get this, some of those materials flow back into the tubule for excretion. If you're ever feeling overwhelmed, come back to this idea. The glomerulus takes more stuff than it needs from the blood, and the tubules give some of it back and only keeps the waste. The first step is glomerular filtration, which, as the name implies, only happens at the glomerulus. Your kidneys filter about 125 milliliters of blood per minute this way. Other variables like blood pressure or hormones can push more or less molecules into the capsule too, but after all is said and done, ions and water made it through, as well as glucose, lipids, amino acids, and urea. Now, these These next two processes, tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion, happen at different points in the tubules. These processes are constantly happening with different substances at different rates in your convoluted tubules and loop of Henle. The exact specifics of how and why different substances cross the tubules is complex, and I want to keep this simple. So I'll give you some of the highlights, and I'm going to use a simplified diagram to keep the focus on the substances, not the anatomy. Hope that's okay. After coming out of the glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubules transport nearly everything back into the blood, including water, glucose, amino acids, and multiple ions. One of the biggest deals is sodium. About 65% of the sodium that was filtered in the glomerulus is reabsorbed back into the blood, and where sodium goes, water follows. So about 65% of the water that came out of the blood goes back into the blood from the PCT, since it's following the sodium concentration. At the same time, hopefully 100% of glucose gets reabsorbed at this point too, which makes sense. You don't want to pee out valuable calories. Now, about half of your urea, a byproduct of protein metabolism, is reabsorbed here too. We'll come back to this since there's urea in your urine. The filtrate then heads to the loop of Henle. At this point, water in the filtrate flows out of the descending limb of the loop, but in the ascending limb, no water flows out. Instead, a bunch of ions flow out, like sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, and magnesium. And here's what's so cool. Because that ascending limb dumped out all that sodium, it made the space outside of the descending limb super salty, causing water to exit from the descending limb, but not the ascending limb. And this all happens thanks to something called osmolality, how much of one substance is dissolved in a liquid. A super sugary soda has a higher osmolality of sugar than a lightly sweetened soda. Water will flow from areas of low osmolality to high osmolality. The loop of Henle works because of that passive concentration gradient. It's mostly water following the small molecules across barriers. So then we get to the distal convoluted tubule, which actually uses energy to pump out even more ions like potassium, sodium, and chloride out of the tubules. The final collecting tubule has some similar mechanisms to the distal convoluted tubule, so it's not just a static drain. From there, it's all off to the bladder. Okay, quick summary. The glomerulus filtered a bunch of particles out of the blood, and tubular reabsorption put many of those particles back into the blood. But another process, tubular secretion, transports other materials from the blood vessels back into the tubules. I know that nomenclature, calling it secretion, makes it seem like the tubules are secreting something out, but that's not the case. Common misconception. So what gets secreted? Basically any big molecules that we don't want in our bodies. It's like a last sweep of bad stuff that didn't come out during glomerular filtration. So drug molecules, big proteins like ammonia, and certain byproducts of metabolism. This process is also responsible for keeping blood at a consistent 7.4 pH by taking hydrogen ions from the blood, which increases pH, making it more alkaline. Now, this is important to note. Yes, some urea went out from the proximal convoluted tubules into the capillaries, but later on in the PCT, some urea comes back into the tubules. The same thing happens again at the loop of Henle. This is why you have urea in your urine. So now we've got urine, it's ready to flow through those renal pyramids, renal pelvis, and then down to the ureters to the bladder. Then you pee. All in all, our kidneys make about 180 liters of filtrate every day and only urinate about 1.5 liters. That's a really big difference and a nice quantitative example of how effective reabsorption is.
You may have seen one of these little diagrams before. At home, some people keep these urinalysis test kits at home, but they, in color form here, they measure about a dozen different constituents in your blood that are considered important. And that's very useful because your kidneys, since they do regulate things, that means that urine that comes out of your kidneys eventually will show certain things that are being excreted at a certain level. And that's very diagnostic in looking at some diseases or some malfunctions, because whatever comes out of your kidneys is going to show you something about what was in your body. And sometimes your kidneys may not be working properly. They may be excreting something at a different concentration than what it should be. Anyway, these are easy to use, so you'll probably see one of those sometimes. They're the ones you dip in the urine and look at the color after a few minutes and compare it to these. Very easy to look at. Here's something else to think about. The drugs that you take, those are typically for a purpose, obviously, and not talking about recreational drugs here, but if you take Tylenol, Advil, anything there, that's something that your body senses as a foreign invader in certain ways, because that's obviously not something that you would expect in the food you're eating. So even though we intend a drug to have a specific purpose, curing something or something of that nature, we know it doesn't last forever. And that's because your body will automatically just start eliminating it from your system, because your kidneys will think, and along with your liver, they sense that as something that shouldn't be there. And that's why you have to take it, several times a day, maybe. Aspirin and Tylenol about every 4 hours. Takes about 4 hours for your kidney and liver to excrete the Tylenol from your system. Advil, I believe, is about 6 hours. Aleve or naproxen, about 12 hours, isn't it? But every drug has a different half-life in your body, they would say, or different concentrations that have to be done away with. And that also means you can detect the drugs in urine. So the drug test kits that some places give to see if someone is using an illicit recreational type drug, that's why they can do that, because the kidneys will keep on excreting this for probably sometimes days after you've taken something. A lot of drugs like cocaine and heroin stay in your system, and they're very difficult for your liver and your kidney to get rid of in some cases. And this is a way that, some companies, as I said, or whoever the source may be, can test their employees or whoever the students in a school to see if drug use is a problem, because it sticks with you for a while. So some things that can go wrong with your urinary system. Obviously, infections here are not a good thing. And have you noticed with most organs, you don't worry about bacteria getting in it. You don't really worry much about heart bacteria or, liver bacteria, although that does happen. It has different ways of getting in. But kidneys are actually open in a way to the environment when you think about it. If you'll look at this diagram here, it's possible for bacteria to go into the bladder through the urethra and then swim its way up the ureters there to the kidneys. And that does happen occasionally, especially, if you consider the fact that bacteria are pretty common on most surfaces. So it doesn't have to be something somebody does wrong. It's just a fact of nature that sometimes bacteria just get in places they shouldn't get, and they swim around and they go to places they shouldn't go. Anyway, the bottom line here is it hurts pretty bad. So, and obviously you don't want infected kidneys for the fact that they're not functioning probably the way that a kidney should be functioning. So all the more reason to take care of these. Those are called UTIs, by the way. And they have a lot of different ramifications when you look at what could happen. This picture shows some of the various ways that it can affect you in ways that you may not even know that it's a UTI that's affecting you. So take a look at these labels here and kind of get used to that, because some symptoms that people have at certain times, I've known people, a lot of people, that would go for a long time thinking that something else was wrong in their system, and it actually comes down to having a urinary tract infection of some kind. So it doesn't always just hurt where your kidneys are. In fact, most of the time it hurts around where your bladder is. And the good thing to do would be, when you know that it's a bladder infection, to go very quickly and get something done about it before the bacteria are transferred upward to the kidneys in some form, because you don't want to mess with your kidneys. Too important. And finally, we'll look at this big fancy machine here. This is kind of a sad situation, but people whose kidneys are failing, the kidneys are so important. You can't just say, well, my kidneys are not working right, I'll take something and get to feeling better. No, because your kidneys are literally filtering your blood right here. And that's the main purpose we're going to look at in this video, and what we want to concentrate on, because if your blood has things in it that shouldn't be there, you're not going to last very long. and you're especially not going to feel very good in the process. And it really makes you appreciate the fact that your kidneys are so important and so dependable because, I mean, on a daily basis, you get rid of lots of things that if the kidneys just stop for a few hours would quickly build up and cause you lots of misery or even fatality in some cases. But anyway, this is a kidney dialysis machine. Dialysis it literally means going through and cutting. But what it does, it takes all of your blood and sends through this machine. And it has membranes that do sort of what the little things you're going to see in the film are doing. Those nephrons, they allow poisons to and toxins and other waste to filter through the membrane, and then the good stuff stays in. But look at the machine here. Obviously, God made you with two small fist-sized kidneys that we have to have a huge machine like this to do the same thing that a human kidney would be doing. But it's very, very fascinating. And like I said, it's very sad too, because kidney dialysis typically at least 3 times a week, you have to go to one of these machines and stay hooked up to it for 2 to 4 hours. So this takes a big chunk of someone's life to have to go through kidney dialysis. Another good reason for you to donate organs if you have a choice someday. So someday on your driver's license, you'll check a little box that says, yes, if I'm dead, you can have my kidneys and whatever else is being needed at that time.